Good afternoon, and welcome to 25 Minutes with Cap. Today we're going to discuss the cyber market. And as I titled the discussion, are we in the beginning of the cyber market, or are we in the end? Ransomware, data breach litigation, aggregation risk, is it just too much for insurers to handle, or maybe it is and they haven't all realized it yet? In this conversation, I wanted to go beyond the usual questions of loss trends, solar winds, and start to delve into the cyber liability industry in particular. And so who better to discuss this with me than John Mullen, a named partner and co-founder of Mullen Coughlin, one of the leading specialty data breach firms in the country. John, thanks for joining.
Happy to be here.
Awesome. So as we go on from here, if you have questions through the session, feel free to enter them into the chat and we'll do our best to answer them. So first off, wanted to start with this. John, you were one of the first people in the cyber liability space, albeit as an attorney. How'd you get into this?
Well, you make me sound so old, and I do have the gray hair to prove it. When I started into this, my hair was your color. So just for context purposes, about 20 years ago, we used to kiddingly call Philadelphia the center of the cyber universe. There were a number of people at what was then Cigna, became ACE, and also the AIG guys who were in this region. And they were having a difficult time getting risk managers, and this will sound familiar, risk managers to appreciate the risk that comes with cyber, right? Well, try doing that in 2002 and 3. And ultimately, several of them asked me and a guy named Mark Reisinger, who runs Net Diligence, could you guys come in as non-underwriters, non-brokers, and i.e. not salespeople, and explain all these new laws, all this new tech, and how this is going to create a risk that really wasn't there before. And so, although reluctant in the beginning, Mark and I stepped up and along with a couple people came up with a PowerPoint and began the process of educating the risk management community. I probably did, and this is not an exaggeration, 500 to 700 speeches between 2002 and 2007 before I actually got my first case where I managed a breach. So, and that was really just working with a lot of the big carriers, got to know a lot of the brokers, and you know them all, Adam, because you were around in those days. No one was important. No one had a title. No one really was more than a junior at anything that they were doing. Now many of them run entire books, entire, brokerage teams, et cetera. So it's actually kind of fun to see the evolution over the time. And of course, now with the way cyber has exploded in the last 3 to 5 years, we're no longer in search of that one headline that we would then put on a PowerPoint and then talk about for a year because it was the only headline we had to use for that year. So we're a little past that now.
TJ Maxx. That was the one that we owed you, right? Yes.
Yeah. And then it was PF Chang's and yeah.
Right. And so what are you up to now?
Well, about 5 years ago, I started my own firm. It was with the same people that I started, 8 to 10, 12 years ago in terms of once the breaches started to roll into cases, I actually had to select lawyers at my old firm 2 firms ago and teach them what it was I had been doing, Cristiano, Jim Prendergrass, Jen Coughlin. And fast forward, we started our own firm. We have, give or take, 95 lawyers. The only thing we do is data privacy and security. That's it. And pretty much exclusively that work funnels to us via underwriters, claims people, and brokers in the insurance community. We don't spend a lot of time, almost none, running around trying to introduce ourselves to random companies or entities in hopes that someday they'll need us. That's not a good business model. So what we have done is we've latched into and helped drive revenues for the underwriters and the brokers with the ultimate philosophy that if you help people drive in the revenue, eventually they're going to turn to you for your expertise on the other side. And it worked out pretty well. And because it's the only thing we do, it gives insureds who have problems a comfort level when they get on the phone with us for the first time and we're trying to introduce ourselves when they're getting hacked and they're freaking out. It helps when you're able to say, guys, we've been doing this for 20 years and it's all we do. And if we don't take good care of you effectively, we'll put ourselves out of business. So people like hearing that. And we've probably handled, when it's all said and done, something north of 20,000 matters since we started.
So it's funny, you were talking about, the 500 to 600 talks that you gave '02 to '07, and, I gave a few of those talks, I remember as well.
Yes.
Is there something that you look back on, knowing what you know now about the cyber market and the cyber business? Hey, I wish I was telling people about this. Maybe we would have made more sales. Maybe we would have been brought in for more things earlier on.
Yeah.
Is there something? Yeah.
Honest to God, I really think it's a matter of scale. So I don't think that there's one thing. Like, yes, we could have talked about ransomware then because it was there
Sure.
then. No one
Sure.
anticipated what it would become. So I actually think the learning curve, you could have plotted it out in an econ class. It took a while to get going. And then once you get to critical mass, you see the gross written premiums start going up in the country, and then you get real market penetration. To answer the first question you had, Adam, if we at the beginning, the middle, or the end of the process, unequivocally, we're still at the beginning. And I spend, as you know, a ton of time with brokers, several of whom have already texted me since we started this conversation because they're listening. And I spend a ton of time with underwriters. And when I ask the cumulative group that is the cyber industry, what's the market penetration of the entities in the United States who should be buying this, which is pretty much everybody? What's the percent penetration? And the answer is, give or take, 20%. So,
Right.
you've got a multi-billion-dollar gross, premium per year in the country, but I would expect, and most people do expect, that it's going to double and then triple at least. And that's not even counting the rate going up, per deal.
Right. 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 So every one of the cyber carriers had a plan.
Yep.
People had risk management. People had underwriting expertise. They said they had underwriting expertise. They had a technical model. What went wrong?
Well, if you look at this in the quarter by quarter basis, things went wrong. But if you look at it in a years and decades basis, nothing is going wrong. The market's maturing. We're seeing an evolution of a risk. And although the 2020 numbers weren't great, if you look back at the carriers that have been in it for a dozen, 15, 20 years, I have no doubt that they're way on the plus side still on the profitability of this product. So yeah, a year happened where people got hammered. There was COVID. There was a lot of more remote working. At the same time, ransomware really took it up a notch, and people, some carriers, took a pretty big hit last year. But even now, from what I'm seeing in 2021, those same carriers have already, in many respects, adjusted and made themselves profitable again. So I don't consider a bad year to be a failure. It's a bad year. And like most things in a market, you've now seeing a maturing of the product, of the market, of the recognition of what's an appropriate rate, of the controls, of the actual underwriting that is now allowed to happen that perhaps wasn't allowed before. So there's a lot of things going on. So I don't think anybody got it wrong. I think some people got it more right than others. And that goes to the companies that insisted on underwriting more vigorously took less of a hit than the companies who did not, which is not news to anybody.
So, yeah, sure. So, we're not gonna talk about actual carriers, of course, but what's an example as you see it of because of course you're working on these, you're working with many of these companies in their worst days
Yep.
in terms of the insureds. What are kind of trends that you've seen where, hey, it seems like a lot of people have had this problem, and if underwriters were looking at X, Y, and Z, maybe this wouldn't have been a problem?
Yeah, so I don't want to blame my broker friends, but underwriters can only underwrite when they're permitted to underwrite by the market, right? So my impression was, if you wanted to do volume deals, you were forced by the market to ask less questions, to do some algorithmic planning, and try to build a simple box that made it simple for people, brokers and buyers, to fill out as few questions as you can and then get the product. And people had to sort of work within the box that they were permitted to work with. And that's what I was saying before.
Sure.
What we're seeing now with the uptick in the ransom demands, both on the severity and the frequency, now people are asking more questions. It's generally speaking, it's not 5 questions and you get a bid anymore, or a quote, or 10 quotes. It's a little more than that. Now, obviously, as you get down the food chain and you get into the truly small and micro businesses, there's a lot of that probably still going on. And that makes sense because, you have to have, in some ways, almost a touchless process when you get down to a $5 million entity, and there's millions of those out there, right? So to me, it really all comes back to it's a balance that works between underwriting and brokers. The brokers want to protect their clients and get them the right product for the right price, but the brokers now have seen and realized that, hey, some underwriting is going to be healthy for my client, because if they're put through somewhat of a testing and a pressurized evaluation on how tight are their controls, how well is their setup and their plan, then my client is going to be in a better position. Yes, it's a little more inconvenient to answer more questions and a little more intrusive, but big picture, a lot of the brokers, the more mature brokers, have seen that as a plus, and they're working with the carriers, recognizing that you need a market. And if you try to drive everything down to lowest cost for everything, the carriers will back out, and then the brokers have nothing to sell. So I do think there's been a nice combination with the brokerage community and the underwriting community to respond to this sort of deluge of ransomware claims. Having said all of that, and you and I talked about this, the claims are just as many as last year, maybe even a tick up in terms of frequency. They are not as severe as they were last year, and it's by a factor of 2 or 3. So certainly in our numbers, and this year we will handle 4,000 plus claims. Last year we handled probably 3,500, and our average ransom demand, not payment, but demand last year was in excess of $5 million. And that was skewed because we had a handful, 20s or 20 to 30 of them, that were $30 million, $60 million. We're not seeing the 30 millions and the 60 millions anymore. Now we're seeing 8, 7, or 100,000, or 1 Bitcoin, or whatever the case may be. So the demand has dropped under $1 million from above 5. That's a huge drop. The average payment has dropped from, I don't know what it was, 500,000, give or take. Again, skewed to the high side by a couple big cases, but it's dropped to under 200,000. So again, not nothing, but in terms of impact and severity, those numbers are notably improved from last year.
But what do you attribute that to? Because if you're underwriting that business, you say, okay, that's good news, but is it anything that the underwriters have actually done? Is it random? Is it about what happened with pipeline?
No, it goes back before that. I think it's the underwriters know the questions to ask by and large. They are now being permitted to ask them. By asking them, the buyers, the risk managers become better risks, because they're saying, yes, 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 no, no. Well, the 2 no's need to be yeses to get the policy. So the risk manager makes sure that their shop changes and adapts and becomes a better setup, because the brokers sort of understood the process, and the underwriters needed that to happen for the risk to be good enough to write the risk.
Right. I'm more, though, when you say it goes from 5 million to under $1 million.
Yep.
Why? Is there anything that the underwriter did there, or is it luck?
No, I actually think it's the government, and it may be a plural, governments. A year ago now, nothing much was happening. People were talking about, maybe we'll pass legislation, maybe we'll do this, maybe we'll do that. And then all of a sudden, in the fall, the Ryuk team, which was a huge threat actor, just went away. Now, you can speculate on how they just went away, but if Adam and John were having our own ring and we were reeling in millions of dollars and we just disappeared, we did that for a reason. I have a sense from when you talk to the people in the industry, you talk to the government types, you get a sense some governments, maybe plural, did something to break up that team. And then it happened again with the dark side team when I'll just use the term, they overreached. I don't think that, now this, you're asking me, it's a little bit of speculation. My sense is DarkSide had no idea that when they hit Colonial, it was going to cut 40% of the East Coast oil off. And when they did, they went poof, because they knew that Ryuk had in some level been taken out, 6 months earlier. They didn't want to be the next story. So they just went, we're gone. So
Right.
I think, look, if you and I were the bad guys and we're over in Eastern Europe somewhere and we're hiding and we're knowing what's happening to our competitors, what are we saying to each other over our vodka? We're saying, hey, we need to keep doing this. We're making a killing, but we can't be doing these $30 million deals anymore. And let's not go after infrastructure, because if the governments of the world decide we're a problem, they will find us and we will be
Right.
shut down. And that's being generous. So I do
Right.
think, I don't think it's the underwriters. I think it's some level of government running interference here and maybe taking out the worst of them and sending a
Sure.
message to the rest of them that it's not free anymore and it's not without risk.
Sure. Well, one of the things, thanks. And one of the things you've talked about with ransomware is, you know, you do your best underwriting, something happens.
Right.
But in terms of adjusting and dealing with a ransomware, where do the biggest mistakes take place?
Yeah, I would say two big. This is making the assumption that the entity we're talking about actually listened to their broker and actually bought a policy, right? So
Sure.
assuming the biggest mistake you can have is not having the policy. I swear to God, and
Sure.
I would say that to anybody, and I have said that to non-insurance audiences because, and I've said this before as well. The insurance community figured out the response problem. They know how to do it. They've done it 20s of 30s of thousands of times. There is a process. It works. So if you have the policy, you're already ahead of the game. And based on the stats we were talking about before, you're already in the top 20% of the class just by having the
Sure.
policy. So 80% of the people don't even have it yet. So that's the biggest problem, not having the insurance. But assuming your question is for those of people who are insured,
Yes.
two things happen to screw up cases. One, delay. They think they can handle it in-house. They think they're smarter than everybody else. Maybe the IT people are so convinced they're the best because they used to work at fill in the blank,
Yeah.
that they're not going to share that they have a problem until it's out of their control. So I think that's partly the delay piece. And that can happen with IT. It can happen with the C-suite. It can happen, God knows, with general counsel's office, because the lawyers are the worst. I know this because I am one. But everybody thinks they're smarter than they are. And so everybody tries to handle something when they shouldn't. And the other thing I would say is going outside the channel. In other words, I don't care that your brother-in-law, was Harvard, and he's the best lawyer you've ever met. If he doesn't do cyber, he doesn't do cyber. Yeah, I don't care that your neighbor down the street used to be an FBI agent and says she knows cyber, but doesn't really know cyber, but just started up a new shop and she's impressive with her resume. So let's go to her. The carriers know who's good and they know who works and they know who can make it repeatable and scalable. And so using the experts that have been vetted through a decade plus of vetting by the carriers, because we both know carriers aren't in this for charity. You don't get to keep these jobs as lawyers, as forensic people, as PR people, unless you can prove it and repeat it and do it in scale. So to me, it's the random choice to pick the brother-in-law lawyer or the really sharp law firm that does all your employment law. Great. I mean, the example I used to you before was I have a great general practitioner. He's my age. His kids are my age. We get along with no trouble for 25 years. If I ever have to have knee surgery, he's not going anywhere near my knee with a blade. Why? Because he doesn't do knees. Yeah, he's a doctor. He's super smart. He doesn't do knees. He's not looking at my knee. Same thing here. We constantly see. Another mistake we see on the forensic piece is the team at the impacted entity will hire the entity they already use to support them from outside for security reasons on the computer side. So it's never really a good idea to select the company that provides the security support services to fix the problem that they may well have missed or caused. That doesn't look good to anybody. And there's a CYA element to that. And the regulators never listen to those results because they're not credible on their face. So that's another thing we see a lot of.
Right. The ransomware has been the main driver for poor experience over the last year or two. But one of the concerns that has kind of loomed over this business for the last, well, since it started, is aggregation concerns and aggregation exposures over over outages and business interruption, dependent business interruption has been a coverage that's continually expanded. Do you see movement in people understanding what their aggregate exposure is?
So my answer to you is yes. The best of the brokers and the best of the underwriters have been planning and doing analysis of the aggregation risk for a decade. They just because it hasn't happened in any meaningful way, it doesn't mean there's not a dozen plus of those big carriers all over this issue. They are. They know more about it than I do because it's their job to know more about it than I do. Our job, we fit in our box, right? So we come in, we help put out the fire, we figure out what's going on,
Sure.
we manage the legal piece and all that. But yeah, I do think, and I also think you're going to see, you're not going to see that growth of the policy anymore. It used to be every time there was a new ask, the market sort of forced a soft market to grant what that coverage was. I think some of those coverages are being pulled back or priced differently or priced at all. It's not clear that a lot of those coverages ever were priced. I think they were just given. And I think now, as time goes on, you're going to see them, you're going to get charged for them or you're not going to get them.
Anything on the top of your head in terms of coverage that you think's going to be pulled back?
Well, you're already seeing people sublimit and do other things on the ransom payment piece. So
Yeah.
we already know that's happening. There's coinsurance, there's higher deductibles, there's sublimits that didn't used to be there. Obviously the rate has increased notably, and we're not talking 10, 20% anymore. We're talking 40, 50, 60, 70%. And that's all appropriate. Now the market is right sizing and right fitting.
Great. Have a question that came in here, and we were going to cover this topic, so figure we should hit it now. Insurtech firms, I'm reading the question, came in a few years ago with underwriting from a technical standpoint as opposed to actuarial. Do you think the cyber market would be different if traditional carriers had underwritten that way from the get-go? I will say up front, I don't know what their loss ratios currently are, comparatively speaking. Why don't you start with that first, then I'll jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think the bigger carriers have the same technical abilities as the insurtechs. We work with both, so I'm not looking to upset anybody. I think that we see losses from both. So I'm not at all convinced that one is ahead of the other I know that the carriers, in most respects, carry their own risk. The insurtechs, some do, most don't. But behind them are carriers. So at a certain level, it's not like the insurtechs are existing in their own little world. They've got carriers behind them. They've got reinsurance behind those carriers. So they're subject to the same thing. I don't think the tech that's now being used was out there 15 years ago. I'm pretty sure it wasn't. So, but I wouldn't sort of the premise. I wouldn't accept the premise that the insurtechs use a certain magic tech and the carriers don't. The carriers do as well. The carriers don't always sell it as well, but they have a lot of the same information as their underwriting.
Is that what you think it is? That it's more that the insurtechs have just been better at marketing?
No, I wouldn't say just at marketing. Some of what they do is really cool and innovative. So no, I give them credit for that. I also think a lot of them are really dialed in just to cyber, right? And the carriers, they have to devote a lot of resource to a million other products, and it's not just cyber. So if you, much like us, right? All we do is cyber. A lot of the insurtechs do are cyber or E&O and is cyber. And so they're really dialed in, and that's where their marketing is going to be. And they've already seen where the holes are that they are trying to fill in the market. So I think they're doing a tremendous job. And I think it all sort of balances out when you play it out over years.
One of the questions that you asked, or one of the things that you had said early on was, hey, if you're underwriting a 5 million revenue company, you can really only ask 5 questions, and I get that. That's all you can ask, but is it enough questions to ask?
No, it's not. It's not enough questions because the people in the $5 million company still own it and are still worried about it, and they can go out of business just like anybody else. And you should, frankly, welcome the chance to be tested if you want to be insured like this.
So, I
Trying to
mean,
go
do
in
you,
and do it the lowest common denominator is not the good way to run a company. You should want to be tested by the process of buying the policy.
can you underwrite can you underwrite micro cyber then, or is this going to continually be a loss leader?
I don't think it'd be a loss leader. I know companies who write micro, where the limits are really low, the premiums are under $1,000, and those guys are doing just fine. They have a volume play. They see
Mm,
occasional losses. I could tick off two or three right now who are kicking butt because their clients aren't getting hit with ransomware because they're so small, nobody cares about. So it depends on what niche you're talking about.
okay. Okay. Well, hey, we're out of time here, and this was a great discussion. Give me 30 seconds on what's your prediction for the rest of the year and going into 22 in the cyber market.
I think everybody's going to have higher revenue. I think that everybody's going to have better loss ratios. And I think that the market's going to continue to grow. It's not a market that can be ignored. It won't be ignored. You can't have potentially a $20 billion a year US only marketplace that the insurance industry is going to avoid. Not going to happen. So I see a lot of growth coming up. I see continued maturity of the market, allowing to underwrite. And I think we're already in a better place than we were a year ago. I think that's going to continue. That's not to say there won't be more claims. There'll be plenty of claims.
Great. Hey, John, thanks a lot for joining, and really appreciate it. And everyone else, thanks for listening to the conversation. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.